Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Now, before we dive deeper into biostatistics, it's important to understand some basic terminology and concepts that we'll be using throughout this course before we start to get any further. Now, again, statistics is all about collecting, analyzing, and interpreting data. And knowing these fundamental concepts will help you apply the statistical method quite effectively. So, in this lesson, we'll cover population versus sample and how understanding the difference between studying an entire group versus a subset of that group, which is the sample, is very important. We will also talk about variables, which are independent, dependent, and co-founding variables, and we will learn how to identify the types of these variables in a study. Then descriptive and inferential statistics is something we will cover. This will help us to distinguish between summarizing data and making predictions. Okay, so by the end of this lesson, you'll have a solid foundation in key statistical concepts. Let's get started. Now, first, let's talk about populations and samples, which are the most fundamental to all statistical studies. Now, a population is an entire group that we want to study. The population of the United States, or even the entire population of Harvard University that are taking a stats course. That includes all. Now, a sample is a smaller subset of that population that we collect data from. Obviously, it is sometimes very difficult, even impossible to collect data from the whole population. So we must use a sample. Now, as an example, suppose we want to study the average blood pressure of adults in the US. The entire United States adult population is the population, but we can't measure every single person. Instead, we must take a sample of, say, 1,000 adults and analyze their blood pressure. Why would we use samples instead of the entire population? Well, it becomes difficult to do the whole population for obvious reasons, but in most cases, studying the entire population is also too expensive, it's too time-consuming, or as I mentioned, pretty much impossible. So instead, we use a sample and apply a statistical inference to draw conclusions about a particular population. Okay, now let's discuss variables. Variables are the characteristics we measure in a study. There are three main types of variables. They are independent variables, which are known as predictors, dependent variables, which are known as outcomes, and co-founding variables, which are known as hidden influences. We'll cover this more in detail. Now, an independent variable, otherwise known as I abbreviated, is what we manipulate or classify in study, and a dependent variable, or DV, is what we measure. To make more sense of this, let's think about an example. Suppose you had to test whether exercise, which is the independent variable, affects cholesterol levels, which is the dependent variable. Exercise is the independent variable because we control or categorize it, meaning we classify it based on its characteristics. And cholesterol level is the dependent variable because it's the outcome that we measure. It's what we want to measure. We want to know what the cause is, if it is exercise, or how it changes the dependent variable, which is cholesterol level. Now, a confounding variable is a factor that influences both the independent variable and the dependent variable, and which potentially distorts the results. The independent variable causes the change. The DV, the dependent variable, shows the effect. And the confounding variable influences both the independent variable and the dependent variable. As an example, let's just suppose we had a study and wanted to study the effect of coffee, the independent variable, on the dependent variable, which we would conclude is heart disease. But the problem is that coffee drinkers also tend to smoke more. So smoking is a confounding variable because it has effect on heart disease, increasing risk independently of coffee consumption. Now let's talk about the two main branches of statistics, descriptive and inferential statistics. Now, descriptive statistics helps us organize and summarize data using the measures of central tendency, which we will cover more in detail, but that includes the mean, median, and mode. There's also descriptive statistics that also help us by using the measures of dispersion, which is range, variance, standard deviation. And we will also cover this in detail. But we would also want to use data visualization, such as histograms, pie charts, box plots, to actually see what the data is telling us and to be able to interpret the data. Now, as an example, suppose we collect data on the average BMI of patients, body mass index, in a hospital. For this scenario, descriptive statistics allows us to calculate the mean BMI, which is the average, and visualize the data with histograms, which is a type of data visualization. And then we are able to report key insights without making broader conclusions about this data. So descriptive statistics really describe what is observed, but they do not make predictions about a larger group. That is important to know. Now, inferential statistics help us make conclusions about a population based on a sample. We do this by using hypothesis testing, which would include t-tests, chi-square tests, and ANOVA. Don't worry, you don't have to know this yet. Confidence intervals, estimating population parameters, and also regression analysis, which are predicting relationships between variables. Now, as an example, suppose we surveyed 500 patients and found that 30% of them have high blood pressure. With inferential statistics, we estimate that around 30% of all patients in the hospital would likely have high blood pressure as well, with, of course, a margin of error. So inferential statistics allows us to go beyond the data and make predictions about the entire population. We infer, as the name implies. So in this video, we covered population versus a sample and why we use samples to estimate population characteristics. We talked about variables as well, the independent variable and dependent variable and confounding variables, and how to identify and classify and study these variables. We also covered descriptive versus inferential statistics and how to summarize data versus making predictions. Now, understanding these basic concepts really sets the foundation. You got this, you're doing great. See you in the next video.